Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Judith Shapiro is a noted cultural anthropologist and the president of Barnard College, the women's college I was fortunate to graduate from more than 50 years ago, and believe me, that is hard to believe. But I wanted to ask you about a women's college. You're an anthropologist, and I understand you've done studies on gender differences. Is that relevant to the fact that you're heading up a women's college?
Well, I think the work I've done on gender differences, and gender is the word we tend to use in anthropology,
Right,
for differences that are social and cultural as opposed to biological, but based on how we view, biological sex differences.
So what does that mean?
Well, that means that the paradox is that in all societies there's a big difference between the lives of men and women. But the differences socially are not the same from one society to another necessarily. So a lot of the beliefs we have about how men and women are different that we think are a matter of biology are not always a matter of biology. Now, when I studied gender differences as an anthropologist, how I first started out was really talking about the differences in the social lives of men and women. And I did work in the Brazilian tropical forest, and in those times, people weren't focusing that much on the whole issue of gender differences. I was doing this research in the late 60s as a graduate student, and that was when, second wave feminism was just getting head of steam. I think that what I've learned in anthropology has been useful, well, generally in life, I find, but certainly as president of a women's college. Now, there are some people that think that women's colleges are important because women are, in some ways, inherently different from men in how they learn or how they think, and I don't believe that.
Oh, that's interesting. You really don't.
No, that's not what I think women's colleges are mainly about. And I should say that not all women's colleges are alike, just the way not all co-ed.
But when you say think differently, you mean the basic...
Have different styles of learning.
Right. Okay.
I think that women's colleges are most important as institutions that promote the interests of women. Because, I do think that gender equity, or equity between men and women, is steady work for a lot of reasons. And I think that women's colleges are places that can be counted on to promote the interests of women.
But there are studies that show that women who attend women's colleges are more apt to study subjects not usually studied by women in coeducational.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think that's because they don't encounter expectations that they can't do it. I think what women's colleges do is to really give the women who go to them the idea that they can do anything they want to do, and that there are no things that are no fields that are off limits, or women are less likely, to be able to succeed in, because those things become self-fulfilling prophecies. If people expect you not to do something, it's more likely that you won't do it.
So do you think that applies also to lower schools?
I think so. I think that obviously kids differ from one another, and I wouldn't want to say that the only hope for women is to go to all girls' schools and all women's schools, because that would be a very desperate situation since there are all those other schools out there. But I think they're an important alternative to have out there, and I also think they can be very important at times in life when the pressures to conform to gender stereotypes are the strongest.
And when is that, do you think?
Teenage years, for example.
Is that what's considered to be the most pressure time?
Well, I think so.
I remember Sheila Tobias 100 years ago with math anxiety and started. Does that get cured if a young girl goes, you think, to an all-girls school? They're more likely to be encouraged. It's not showing their skills versus a boy. I mean, what happened?
I think Sheila Tobias talked about a lot of interesting things, like the tendency for scientists to think that they're winnowing out those who don't qualify in order to maintain the sacred fraternity of brilliant scientists. And we also tend to think of, science, that's something I can do or I can't do. I have talent for it or I don't, as opposed to, that's something I'll get better at if I work at it. So she was really thinking about how we can teach science, particularly to women or to minority students, to groups that have been led to believe that they can't do it.
I read a study that said that the most success is with people that are of color. or one, I don't want to use the word minority, and
Right.
I don't know what to use anymore.
Exactly.
But that you have more success in single-sex schools generally. This is not necessarily in college, but in high school.
Right. Well, no, I think
Women and
also people of color of
but
both,
almost all
both men
people of
and
color, because it's a lower socioeconomic class.
well, because there's such a need there that
Yeah.
you can really see an amazing
Right.
change because of the
But
disadvantage.
don't they say that girls, when they're in coeducational schools, and maybe this is high school, maybe not college, but I think it's most likely in college too, are more intimidated as to asking questions and being as assertive as they could be when that they're more assertive in a same-sex environment?
Yeah. Again, there's a lot of information that shows that women are more likely to speak up. All
Right.
things being equal, when you say all things being equal, you're more likely to speak up if you come from New York, for example.
Right. Is
But-
that true? Do you find that?
Oh, yes. I
Is that
think,
right?
Well, you know what New Yorkers are
Yeah.
like. If they're thinking about something, you're likely or
And
necessarily.
we really are. You can really see that with the kids at school.
Yeah, well, we have a lot of New Yorkers.
Yeah.
But
What percentage comes from New York? Do you know?
well, from the state of New York, or it depends on whether the state of New York or the metropolitan
Yeah.
area, somewhere in the low 40%. And then our first state at Barnard is New York, then
Yeah.
New Jersey, then California.
Oh, that's so
So
interesting.
we're
That's
pretty
the other side.
bicoastal.
But
yeah.
you really can see a difference in attitudes or in traits or something, the way kids do. Or isn't
Yes,
it?
I
That's
mean,
so interesting.
I mean, you know, we anthropologists like to look at cultural differences and language. I mean,
Yeah.
there was just an article on the front page of the New York
Right.
Times about whether Mayor Bloomberg is sounding
Right,
less
sounding
as
more
if he
like-
comes
right,
from Boston,
right.
more as if he comes. So certainly, cultural differences enter in, and students, you know, whether they're American from Native American
Yeah.
societies where it's not thought proper, you know, to put yourself forward as much. So cultural differences enter in too, but it's definitely the case that women are likelier. There's a lot of research to speak up when there aren't. I mean, I have found that often women students will not want to speak up until they're sure that
They know the answer.
know the answer, whereas a lot of the male students will launch into talking in the hope that
Right.
the point
They'll
will
hit it.
emerge, and are more willing to sort
Right.
of take
Right.
on airtime.
Yeah, well, they have more. Is it that
yeah.
they just have more confidence and they're so used to really being able to
Well,
just talk the? I don't know.
it's interesting because girls are verbal
Yeah.
for the most part
Right.
earlier on in
Right.
their lives than boys.
Yeah.
But I don't want to engage in too many genders. These are all statistical things.
You actually taught before you became
For
president.
many, many
Yeah.
years. I started teaching, my first job was at the University of Chicago in the anthropology department. I was the first woman hired in the anthropology department there. So I started there in 1970.
You must have learned something being the first woman.
It was not only was I the first woman, but I was the only really junior member of the department. What they should have done in bringing the first woman was not someone who was a very junior person,
Yeah.
hadn't even finished a dissertation,
Right.
but to have found 3 highly qualified senior women faculty. But in any event, wonderful university. But I decided rather than stay there to move to a liberal arts college. I moved to Bryn Mawr, and that's where I discovered the wonderful world of women's colleges. I stayed there for 19 years, 10 as a faculty member. Then I sort of got drafted into administration. I was the chief academic officer at Bryn Mawr, and then became president of Barnard in 1994.
It seems like yesterday.
It does.
And you went to Brandeis, which was
I went to Brandeis,
coeducational.
which was coeducational as an
right. So
undergraduate.
it's an interesting kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you have any connection with preschool, for instance? I mean, I remember years ago, and still non-sexist education became a big thing, so that it would seem to me this whole continuum really begins at very early age.
Well, Barnard actually has a toddler center on its campus that the psychology department is very involved with. So there are boys
great.
and girls in that. And we also have a variety of programs of outreach to the public schools. I think generally, even leaving aside women's education, it's really important for the colleges and universities to get involved in the public school system, because there are a lot of, as we know, a lot of
Yes.
problems there.
Right. But it's interesting also that we're beginning to see one of the other aspects about a liberal arts women's college is
Yeah.
that they tend to be small, but that's
Right.
another asset that we talk about in education is a small liberal arts college, right?
It's interesting because
Whether it's same-sex or co-ed.
Right. It's interesting because most students tend to apply to large universities. And then they get a little lost in the shuffle, or they realize that they're not getting that intense, wonderful attention for members of the faculty who, at a place like Barnard, you really become a colleague in a way, a junior colleague to your faculty members. They're very distinguished scholars, but they are really there for the students in a wonderful way. So it's important that Barnard and its peer institutions have that small liberal arts college experience. Now, we're advantaged especially because we're also partnered with Columbia University right across the street. So if a student, wants to study fourth-year Arabic, because it's a very small institution, can't mount all of those programs. They have the liberal arts college experience at Barnard, which is a generally autonomous, independent institution, but with this close tie to Columbia. And the students go back and forth in both directions. A lot of Columbia students take courses at Barnard, Barnard students at Columbia.
But Barnard has never really been a part of Columbia.
Barnard
it has a separate administration and faculty.
Exactly. It's had a legal partnership throughout its history with Columbia, but it has always had its own faculty. And that's really the key to its being, a true liberal arts college. So the relationship is a close and good one, but there is no other case like it in the world of higher education.
Is there a trend in higher education for back to same-sex colleges?
It's not that there's a trend toward back to establishing new same-sex. And when you say same-sex, it's interesting that while there are 60 some odd women's colleges, private women's colleges, there are maybe 2 or 3 men's colleges. There's just not the market, even less of a market for the men's colleges. And that's really why when all of the major men's institutions, including the Ivy League institutions, went co-ed, it was really a matter of finances and the quality of the applicant pool. Now, what's interesting when you talk about a move back is there was a very interesting study at Duke University a while back, while the president of Duke was a woman who used to be the president of Wellesley, of course, a distinguished sister institution of Barnard. And they did some very interesting research that showed a disturbing sort of backward movement on the part of a lot of the current Duke undergraduate women who were, feeling they had to always look right in addition to being very smart, and much more of these gender stereotypical attitudes. They did a study of their alums and found that the alumni that had graduated while there was still a separate women's college at Duke seemed to have a greater sense of confidence and, just self-strength than the women who graduated afterwards. So there's something to be mindful of. See, when we...
Are they going back to having a...
I don't think they'll go to having a totally separate women's college, but what they're trying to do is to have programs that will fulfill the, same purposes.
Now, Douglas College in New Jersey they're contemplating putting that back into Rutgers.
Yeah.
That was never an independent, was it an independent?
Well, I think at one point may have been. Douglas is interesting because it's a public institution, Rutgers. Douglas, I forget at what point they stopped having their own faculty. Douglas has some very, very strong women's programs, institutes and special programs. I'm sure there are financial issues, going on that's pushing that at Douglas. But I hope they find a way not only to preserve Douglas as a women's college, but their various colleges, because a lot of the big universities are now trying to have honors colleges so that they can see if they can have that liberal arts college experience.
It's similar also with the Department of Education in the city that we're trying all these smaller schools because we can say, I guess, smaller schools mean more attention, more support, right? More caring environment.
Yep. Get to know the students.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the students. I'm fascinated that you say you can tell a New York student. I love it. And I'm a politician, so I reject this red-blue state thing because I believe you can find a commonality and that.
Oh yes.
It's just
no,
not
I don't want to make too much of this. That was partly
That's all right. I love
a New York joke.
But even if there is a difference at the end of the 4 years, do they understand each other better and sort of become?
Oh, I wouldn't say
change?
that there's a cultural barrier between New Yorkers.
I know.
I mean, they all come to Barnard clearly because they really want to be in New York.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because some of the ones that come from California are transplanted New Yorkers sending their kids back to the old country. But they become very, I think there's something about going to school in New York. They become very savvy, being in a place like New York. The internship program you can have in a place like the city, whether it's, it's in television studios, media centers, research universities, hospitals, government offices, all these kinds of museums, galleries.
Politicians' offices.
Politicians' offices.
Right.
Oh, yes, we really like. And when you say politicians' offices, that's something we really want to get students more involved with, because what I tend to notice about the students is that they are very, very interested in making society better. And we find that the kind of students that come to Barnard, even compared to their peers, really want to make the world a better place. And they're involved in all kinds of civic projects and civic engagement of all kinds. There are too few of them, though, who cross the bridge into involvement with the formal political system, running for office. And it's not a very attractive prospect these days, and for many reasons.
Very hard.
And you know, it's whether it's so much about fundraising or about the fact that the proportion of having to run for office versus actually doing your job is far too high. We should be shortening the campaign season.
But they understand the relationship, don't they, between the political system and making the world better, or
well,
not, or making it better for some people, or changing the world. I always wondered.
I don't know if they understand it well enough, and they also see all these cases. I mean, look at the current scandal in Congress. I mean, they feel that the corporate money is so big, and they can develop, as do older people, a certain sense of fatalism. But we want them to understand that you got to get in there, and it's not going to change.
Maybe it's that way because they're not there, and that we really need them. And it's a wonderful opportunity, actually. It's a good time for them to go into it, especially a good time for women and everything else. But it's a very quiet scene, it seems to me, on campuses about the war in Iraq.
Well,
that's
true. I mean, it's certainly nothing like. I mean, well, if equally early on, I'm trying to think of how long it took to really gather a head of steam about the Vietnam War. There have been, you know, there are forums that students, you know.
Right, we did a lot. There were a lot of teach-ins,
but
then,
not,
yes,
but not as much as one might want to see.
Is it because there's no draft?
Well, you know what? Another thing, yes, that would certainly get everyone's attention very quickly, particularly if they drafted both men and women.
Right, exactly.
But I think also that students now are less likely to think of societies generally in terms of, really to think structurally and generally about societies. They tend to focus a lot on interpersonal relations. And I wrote a piece a while back where I talked about how students, instead of using the word class to talk about social class differences, were using this word classism, like sexism and racism. And I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. And did it mean you should be sensitive to people from different social classes, as opposed to should you try to distribute income in our society a little differently from the way it is? So I think, and to be fair...
So it's a little more passive then?
A little more interactional and interpersonal. I mean, if you think about it, to be fair to the students, they're in a much more diverse community as students than I was, or maybe you were when you were in college.
Well, so certainly than I was.
Certainly they have to navigate a whole lot of differences in ethnicity, race, class, much more, I think, than we did when we were in college. But it's important to get them to lift their eyes above that immediate interpersonal level or immediate let's help at the soup kitchen level to what are the major things that are making our society operate?
What made me think about it, and I haven't thought about it for years, is world federalism. That was a big issue when I was in college. And in a way, it's a ripe time for that. Certainly, but then the UN's had its own corruption problems and lack of respect.
Right.
But certainly if you've got women and students from all countries, and I think you've described the sensitivity, the fear of offending Palestinians, or the fear of offending Jewish students, or the fear of offending this group or that group, that it would be the time to gather everybody together and try and get a worldwide new perspective out of it.
There's two things in what you're saying. One is this notion about making people comfortable, that people have to feel comfortable. Well, education isn't about being comfortable. It's about being challenged. So I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on making things smooth and sensitive and comfortable, and then you're just sweeping things under the rug. In terms of international and a global perspective, we tend to think of globalization in terms of the market and the economy, and there's got to be a strong international rule of law, and to get people interested really in focusing on that, I think is important.
Are students more interested in making money these days?
Well, Barnard students, I would have to say, which is one of their wonderful qualities. We do these surveys of student attitudes where we compare ourselves to other institutions, And Barnard students really rank comparatively high on develop a meaningful philosophy of life, be helpful to others, make the world a better place. So they tend to combine ambition with larger goals than just, a lot of them are certainly interested in succeeding, but I don't think they have that just, let's see how much money I can make attitude.
I'm sure one of the big differences is what you're going to do with your life. When I went to college, you're going to go to college,
right.
You'll get a job, you'll get married, and you have children, and your life ends.
Right.
That's it. You'll spend your rest of your life doing that. That's not really the goal.
No, that is not at all. But when I was in college, not that long
no,
after
but it's a different. Oh, please.
But but it was 10 years
all
or
right.
so. Those of us who were planning to work were simply, or knew we were going to have a career, were simply not thinking about how we were actually going to organize our lives.
Right.
So we were kind of like floating. Oh, I'll do this, I'll do that. We weren't thinking. What is different is the students today are more conscious of issues around, okay, how can I balance work and family? How can I possibly work that out? And our society doesn't make it easy.
Have they found an answer?
Well, I think a lot of them realize they can do a lot of stuff, but maybe not simultaneously.
You can't do it all.
Yeah,
right?
I think the problem is that given that we're living about 100 years these days, I mean, these kids
Hopefully.
probably, we still are putting maximum career pressure on people to really build a career during the same years when they would be extended.
Yeah.
So although there may be some careers that really call for sacrifice, probably, one could arrange things better
right.
so that not as much is sacrificed as happens to most women these days.
When I went to school, it wasn't a president, there was a dean, and it was
Right.
Millicent McIntosh, and she was married to a doctor.
Oh, yes.
She had 5, 6, 7 children.
5 kids. I
Five
think.
kids.
They also played music together.
They were the ideal.
Small chamber.
It was the ideal family, and we grew up thinking
Oh,
you could be.
yes,
It's nothing. You'll be president of you'll be dean of a
Right.
college, and you have the 5 children. You're there.
Yeah.
And was that a big surprise?
Yeah, 2 key ingredients. Husband makes fair
lot of
amount of money,
money.
and
Right.
so do you.
Yeah.
And then 2 very, very good incomes, plus really great household help.
Right, I discovered that.
yeah.
So it was an interesting thing. And a friend of mine said once she saw her someplace and she wanted to go over and have a fight with her because she found out it wasn't possible
Yeah.
or something.
But she was a nice change from the previous president who
Yes.
was really the austere
Right. Oh, yes.
maiden lady type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But do you think that students will get involved in the? I mean, that is a very pessimistic indication.
I didn't mean to be pessimistic.
Do they vote?
Oh yes, we have a wonderful group of activist students who began a Smart Women Vote initiative.
Oh, good.
And after the election, it morphed into Smart Women Lead. And we're starting a new initiative on women's political leadership and
Oh,
also
that's very
women's
good.
leadership in the corporate world.
Right.
And so we really do want to focus on this. And no, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but just to sort of be descriptive and to
No,
say
I know
that there is a
but
challenge.
I'm just saying it's.
No, we got to get them
sounds-
out there.
Yeah.
Now. There is no good alternative to optimism.
Are they? Do they tend to be more? Are they split with the parties? I mean, are they?
No,
more,
well, it is really the case, and this is a bit of a problem. I mean, when people say that overwhelmingly institutions of higher education tend to be liberal, that's true, but I mean, it's not because there's a cabal keeping conservatives out. It's because of who are the kinds of folks that tend to go into teaching, but also who are the kinds of students that tend to apply to certain kinds of colleges. I think what's very important is to find a way not to have there be too much conformity around, we all agree politically, but how do you get really good, strong debate? Because, let's say you're a liberal Democrat, you really need to test your ideas against the most intelligent, sharp-minded people who don't agree with you. And so I think that's very important.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Do you? New York plays a very important role in attracting
yes.
the students.
Absolutely.
Right? And the condition of the city is directly reflected.
Very important. I mean,
are you at the height of your applications?
Oh, yes. We are not only the most sought after women's college, but we are now getting more applications from women than most of the nation's academically selective co-ed liberal arts colleges, and definitely one of the major draws is this. I mean, New York City
at the same
has in
time
a way
NYU is also
NYU, Columbia,
And
absolutely. We're all really benefiting from the kind of shape the city is in. People no longer are fearful of sending, their kids to school in New York. And on the contrary, New York now has become the quintessential college town more so than Boston.
And I think City University is attracting students from outside,
Yeah.
too.
No, the
So
city,
it's an
they
interesting
really
thing.
want to be there. They
So,
really want to be there.
what's your relationship with the city? I mean, you're dependent, really,
Right.
on
Well,
the condition of the city.
For example, you know, if you have a strong art history department, as Barnard does, you don't have to have your campus museum, because your campus museum is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, all the galleries, the Guggenheim, the Neue Galerie. I mean, this is the New York is your oyster. And also for all other aspects. We have our students, for example, in the social sciences and even some of the humanities, we have students fanning out all over the city doing field work. When I grew up in Queens, there were no Hindu temples in Queens.
I know.
But this, you know, the study
Yeah.
of, you know, the person in our religion department who teaches about Hinduism can have students doing field work in Queens.
Right.
So that the diversity of the city, and then we have partnerships with various cultural institutions, the International Center for Photography, and a whole lot of things where we partner with city institutions.
And the city administration recognizes it and really is helpful. I
And
hope.
oh yes, and we seek also to have a lot of. I mean, the mayor's commission on women's issues and the mayor himself has been up to Barnard to partner with us on a study of working women in New York, and you know, he was there during Women's History Month. So we really feel, you know, very, very close to the city.
And you've really produced many leaders in their fields.
Oh yes, oh yes. I mean,
It's not only you, but I think also women colleges. They
women's
say.
colleges. But I mean, if you take Barnard as an example, the current chair of our Board of Trustees is Anna Quinlan. The Chief Judge of the State of New York, Judith Kay, is also an alumna. And on the entertainment side and Sex in the City, we've got Cynthia Nixon. So I mean, we've all kinds of fields.
Well, you're bubbling and filled with enthusiasm, and I know you're happy because you're with a wonderful institution. Thank you very much, Judith Shapiro.
My pleasure.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.